In the bustling marble-clad metropolis of ancient Rome, where engineering triumphs and military might were celebrated as the pinnacles of human achievement, there existed an enemy no legion could conquer, a mysterious affliction that seized the mind and body, stealing control in a terrifying spectacle. This enemy was epilepsy. The Romans, for all their pragmatism, did not call it a disease of the brain. They called it the morbus sacer, the sacred disease. This designation was not one of respect, but of profound fear and superstition. To the Roman mind, a convulsive seizure was not a mere physiological event. It was a visible, violent intervention by a divine or malevolent power. The victim, frozen in a moment of utter helplessness, was believed to have been touched by the gods, possessed by demons, or struck down by a celestial fury. It was a terrifying public display that fractured the thin veneer of Roman societal order. The fear surrounding the sacred disease was so immense that it governed daily life and even politics. If a seizure occurred during a meeting of the comitia, the Roman assembly, or a public address, the entire event would be immediately dissolved and postponed. The appearance of the affliction was interpreted as an ominous sign, a direct veto from the heavens against the proceedings. The sufferer was, therefore, not just sick, but a source of political and religious contamination. For the individual afflicted, life became a brutal existence defined by stigma and social ostracization. The moment a person's body contorted and their breath stopped, they were deemed unclean, a social pariah. In a society that valued physical strength, self-control, gravitas, and civic participation, the epileptic was a walking contradiction, viewed as weak, corrupted, and untrustworthy. Imagine the shame. A Roman citizen, perhaps a respected merchant or a mother, it could be struck down without warning, collapsing in the street, foam at the mouth, their limbs thrashing uncontrollably. Passers-by would not rush to help. Instead, they would often perform a ritualistic spitting a gesture, meant to ward off the evil spirit or divine wrath that had manifested. This simple act of public contempt was a ritual cleansing, isolating the victim further. Physicians like Celsus and Galen attempted to apply rational thought, describing the seizures as an illness arising from physical causes, such as phlegm or black bile disturbing the vital spirits. Yet, even their writings reflected deep-seated cultural fear. The medical explanations coexisted uneasily with the supernatural belief system. In the absence of an empirical cure, desperate families and sufferers turned away from rational treatment and toward the extreme fringes of folk medicine and magic. This overwhelming desperation created a fertile ground for the most extreme and non-rational therapies. Epilepsy was a curse that had to be driven out by an equally powerful force. If the seizure was a loss of the vita life force, then the cure must be the immediate, potent injection of a new vibrant life force. The Romans observed the death of a gladiator or a freshly executed criminal. These were men at the absolute peak of their physical power. Their vita was thought to be explosively strong at the moment of violent expiration. The belief was horrifyingly simple. By consuming the life essence of a dying man, especially his warm blood or organs, one could instantly transfer his supreme physical vitality and purge the malady. This profound cultural desperation, the need to conquer the sacred disease at any cost, rational or otherwise, was the engine that drove the Roman medical establishment toward the most macabre and shocking cure in their history, the systematic use of human flesh and blood. It was a leap from clinical observation into the darkest heart of superstition, paving the way for the brutal, transactional remedy of the arena. The doctors of ancient Rome, though often borrowing their foundational knowledge from the Greeks, particularly the legacy of Hippocrates, operated within a worldview fundamentally different from our own. The bedrock of all Roman medical understanding was the humoral theory. Illness in this system was not a localized physical malfunction, but a catastrophic imbalance of the four elemental fluids: blood, phlegm, and black and yellow bile. When a patient was seized by the terrifying spasms of the morbus sacer, the physician was immediately tasked with identifying which humor had caused the disturbance in the body as pneuma, vital spirit or soul. Treatment often involved purges, bleeding, and dietary adjustments designed to restore equilibrium. This theory offered a satisfying rational framework for explaining illness. It tragically failed to contain the terror of the disease. forcing practitioners to seek remedies far outside the boundaries of logic. The constraints of Roman scientific inquiry exacerbated this problem. Systematic human dissection was rare, often prohibited by cultural taboos. This meant that anatomical knowledge was rudimentary, and the true source of epilepsy, the brain, remained shrouded in mystery and superstition. When science could not provide the answer, the door was thrown wide open to the intuitive, the magical, and the frankly bizarre. Roman medicine often acted less on biological facts and more on the philosophical conviction that strength and essence could be transferred. In this belief system, the efficacy of a treatment was directly proportional to the perceived vitality of its source. A weak herb yielded a weak cure. A powerful source, like the remains of a lion or a fighting bull, promised potency. This concept of vita transference proved to be the horrifying conceptual bridge that connected the gladiator's death to the epileptic's cure. The gladiator, or the legally condemned criminal, was a man who had faced death bravely, whose body was toned by war, and whose life was being violently, spectacularly terminated. At the moment of death, his life essence. His supreme strength was believed to be expelled in a potent, unmixed state. This powerful essence, the Romans reasoned, was the only force strong enough to expel the divine curse or malignant spirit that had taken hold of the epileptic. The physician Pliny, the Elder, and later Galen, recorded these practices, illustrating the strange blend of rigorous observation and utter madness that defined the age. Pliny, in particular, noted the shocking spectacle of epileptics rushing to the arena floor to catch the sanguis calor, the warm, fresh blood, directly. This wasn't a complex, synthesized drug. It was a raw, potent life force. The medicine of this desperate age thus evolved into a form of therapeutic cannibalism. The use of human remains, the gladiator's liver, specifically, was frequently mentioned for its high concentration of blood and perceived seat of the soul, was redefined as a necessary pharmaceutical transaction. The patient was not committing an act of ritual transgression. They were undergoing a medical treatment sanctioned by the highest cultural belief in the power of vital essence. It was a world where a doctor might rationally prescribe a balanced diet one day. The next, instruct a family to seek out the newly severed hand of a corpse to be used as a magical amulet. The desperation stemming from the sacred disease led Roman medicine to discard its Hippocratic oath in favor of raw, terrifying power. By defining the cure as the capture of pure vita, the Roman medical establishment created the ultimate demand for the darkest ingredients harvested in the brutal theater of the arena. VA established the terrifying desperation of the epileptic, and the flawed theoretical framework of Roman medicine that demanded the strongest possible source of vital essence, the vita, to drive out the disease. But where does the doctor find this pure, potent life force? The answer lay not in a garden of healing herbs, but in the bloody, sand-covered floor of the Colosseum. The Roman arena, the ultimate theater of violence and power, provided the perfect ritual space for this macabre medicinal harvest. The gladiator, or the Noxi, the criminals condemned to die in the games, embodied the peak of physical vitality and violent death. Unlike those who died quietly in their beds, these men were killed publicly, violently, and often while fighting with immense, focused strength. Their death was an event designed to release their vita in a sudden, powerful expulsion. This transformation of the fighting ground into a medical supply depot speaks to the absolute moral void created by superstition. The moment the fatal stroke fell, when the crowd roared its approval and the wounded man collapsed, was, for certain desperate attendees, the most crucial moment of the spectacle. The core ingredient sought was sanguis calor, warm, foaming, freshly spilled blood. According to the physicians of the time, the vita was contained in the blood, and its potency was inversely proportional to the cooling of the body. Once the blood cooled, the vital spirit was thought to have evaporated, rendering the cure inert. Speed was essential. Witnesses, including the Christian writer Tertullian, described the shocking mechanics of the collection. As the executioner or the lanista confirmed the kill, attendants, sometimes working for the doctors, sometimes representing the afflicted families themselves, would rush forward. They would carry small bowls or cups, sometimes even handkerchiefs, to catch the immediate, still steaming outflow from the wound. Historical accounts suggest a scene of utter, frantic chaos. The smell of copper and death would mix with the desperate movements of people scrambling through the blood-soaked sand arena. It was a race against time, a grotesque competition between the dying man's cooling body and the consuming crowd. The most effective and, thus, the most desired method was to drink the blood directly from the source, guaranteeing the maximum transference of warm vita. Pliny the Elder himself recorded this disturbing practice, noting that epileptics would drink the gladiator's blood as a draught of life, catching it hot from the dying man. While the blood of a famous gladiator was certainly potent, the blood of the executed criminal was arguably the more reliably accessible source. These individuals had been legally stripped of all human rights. Their bodies were considered state property. There was no moral or legal obstacle to their immediate use in medical compounds. The desperate pursuit of this cure blurred the lines between spectatorship and participation. Epileptics themselves or their desperate families were documented as paying small sums to the arena attendants to be positioned closer to the dying men, sometimes even running past the libertinarius, the attendant who dealt with the corpses, to secure their dose. The transaction of death became literal, immediate, and transactional. One man's violent end instantly became another man's desperate prescription. This system, this unholy harvest, was the perfect storm of Roman cultural traits: the brutal entertainment of the arena, the intense fear of a debilitating disease, and a medical theory that prioritized power over purity. It confirms the central historical fact: the gladiator's final collapse was not merely entertainment. It was the climax of an elaborate, medically sanctioned ritual of life force consumption. For modern historians, the consumption of human blood as medicine sounds like folklore or savage ritual. Yet this practice is not relegated to ambiguous myth. It is chillingly documented in the clinical observations of Rome's most respected intellectuals. The key to understanding this gruesome chapter lies in the specific ingredient demanded by the physicians: sanguis calor, warm-blooded, the extraordinary urgency surrounding its collection. The testimony of Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, provides some of the most visceral and damning evidence. In his encyclopedic Natural History, Pliny discusses epilepsy and the remedies sought for it. He describes a scene that would shock any modern observer. Epileptics drink the blood of gladiators, catching it warm from the wound as a draught of life. This is not an offhand rumor, but is a clear, sober statement by a serious chronicler detailing a known public custom. Pliny highlights two crucial elements: the act of catching the blood, and the emphasis on its warmth, confirming the medical theory that the vita was fleeting. Even the towering figure of Galen, the Greek physician whose work would define Western medicine for over 1,000 years, addressed the curative properties of human remains, albeit with a degree of intellectual detachment. Galen understood the cultural power of these remedies, noting that while he personally preferred less aggressive treatments, he accepted that many physicians and patients believed firmly in the efficacy of the human liver, bone, and blood. Galen's value to this narrative is that he helps us bridge the gap between crude superstition and formalized medicine. He and other contemporary writers discuss how the blood was often prepared, not simply swallowed raw, sometimes dried, powdered, and mixed with other substances to create a formal drug, or theriac. This pharmaceutical step provided a veneer of clinical practice to the inherently barbaric act. The purpose of this preparation was often to make the remedy palatable, or to increase its shelf life. But fundamentally, the source material remained the same: the powerful remains of the slain. The documentation reveals that the collection was an organized and transactional event, far beyond a random dash onto the arena floor. It wasn't just desperate epileptics. Specialized medical attendants or vendors were often involved. They were either employed directly by the doctors who prescribed the remedy, or they worked in league with the Lannister gladiator masters who oversaw the deaths. The critical factor repeated in every account was speed. The collector had mere moments after the executioner's sword fell. They would rush the arena Sen the Hyena to ensure they captured the sanguis calor while it was still. Foaming and pulsing with the life essence, the process had to be quick and direct, maximizing the transference of the warrior's strength to the weak. This focus on immediacy confirms the primitive nature of the underlying belief that the cure was magic, not chemistry. In essence, the Roman medical texts expose a profound paradox. A society that pursued philosophy, law, and engineering perfection simultaneously indulged in a treatment based entirely on savage violence and supernatural transference. The chilling documentation left by Pliny and others is a permanent historical stain, confirming that the most desperate patients in Rome's history found their prescribed remedy not in a pharmacy, but literally at the feet of a dying gladiator. The raw, frantic consumption of sanguis calor on the arena floor represents the most immediate and desperate face of this horrific Roman cure. But the harvesting of human remains was not limited to quick dashes for fresh blood. It extended into the formalized world of Roman pharmacology, where the bodies of gladiators and executed criminals were meticulously dissected for other vital ingredients, the liver and bone. This move from immediate consumption to complex compounds provided a crucial psychological distance for the consumer. When the blood was dried, the organs ground, and the bones powdered, the ingredient was no longer a piece of a powerful man. It was an anonymous, medically recognized component of a drug, often referred to as a theriac. The theriac was perhaps the most famous and complex compound of the ancient world, a renowned antidote originally meant to cure poisons and venoms, eventually evolving into a kind of panacea for everything from fever to epilepsy. Its recipes were elaborate, sometimes involving dozens of ingredients like viper flesh, opium, and exotic spices. Chillingly, in the context of epilepsy, human remains were considered the most potent ingredient in this ultimate remedy. In Roman and earlier Greek medicine, the liver was not just an organ. It was widely regarded as the physical seat of the soul anima, or the primary source of the vital humors, second only to the heart. If the goal was to transfer the vita of a powerful man, then his liver, particularly after a quick, violent death, was believed to contain the most concentrated, potent essence. Medical historians cite clear documentation of the liver being excised immediately after death. Unlike the blood, which was consumed rapidly, the liver would be dried, often roasted and then pulverized. This powder could then be discreetly mixed into wine, honey, or complex pharmaceutical preparations, consumed over a longer period to ensure the consistent transfer of the deceased man's strength. Even the skeletal structure of the powerful men was commodified. Bone meal, particularly derived from the skull or the long bones, was a prescribed treatment for various ailments. The practice of using powdered human skulls to treat headaches or mental disorders was depressingly persistent throughout antiquity and into the medieval period. The bones were stripped of flesh, baked or dried under the sun, and then meticulously ground into a fine powder. This pharmaceutical disguise allowed the remains to be incorporated into pastes and drinks. When a patient was administered a medicine containing bone dust, they were not consciously committing an act of cannibalism. They were taking a medicina prepared by a respected physician, thereby insulating the patient from the horrific source material. This institutionalization of the harvest where the gladiator S-corpse was routinely dismantled by attendants, and the parts sold to apothecaries for inclusion in official theriac recipes shows the depth of the desperation surrounding epilepsy. Roman medical philosophy had, in its quest for the ultimate cure, utterly normalized the unspeakable use of human flesh and bone, turning the victims of the arena into the most valuable and barbaric ingredients in their pharmacopoeia. The fear of the morbus sacer was democratic. It afflicted slaves and senators alike. But the consumption of human remains as medicine was starkly divided along socioeconomic lines. The method of ingestion acted as a horrifying status symbol, reflecting the vast wealth inequality of the Roman Empire. The question of who consumed it reveals the ethical hypocrisy and the complex medical landscape of the age. The practice was sanctioned by a wide range of professionals, from the highly respected Greek-trained physicians working in opulent Roman villas to the humble local healers and root cutters who catered to the plebeians. While the elite physician might prescribe a refined, complex theriac containing powdered human liver, the local healer might simply advise a desperate family to run to the nearest execution ground. For Rome's patrician families and the wealthy elite, consumption came cloaked in pharmaceutical disguise. They would pay exorbitant sums for highly processed remedies, like the aforementioned theriac, prepared by specialized apothecaries pharmacopolae. These drugs were mixed with spices, honey, resins, and wine, obscuring the taste and, more importantly, the origin of the macabre ingredient. The wealthy patient could take their daily dose of epilepsy cure without consciously facing the knowledge that they were ingesting the dried organs of a brutally slain gladiator. Done. The money provided a crucial layer of psychological distance. They could decry the violence of the games while simultaneously funding the secondary trade in the victims. Remains a devastating ethical paradox enabled by their wealth and the medical establishment ES complicity. The consumption was indirect, sanitized, and deeply entrenched in the costly commerce of Roman luxury medicine. They were buying not just a cure, but a moral shield against the horror of its source. In direct contrast stood the poor and the overwhelmingly desperate, who had no funds for expensive apothecaries or complex theriac. For them, the cure was immediate, visceral, and horrifyingly public. As recorded by Pliny the Elder and Tertullian, the poor were the ones literally rushing the arena after the execution. They had no choice but to practice the immediate consumption of sanguis calor, catching the raw, still warm blood in cups or on their hands and drinking it directly. This was a necessity born of poverty, eliminating the middleman, the apothecary, and the cost. The blood being free or very cheap when collected immediately became the treatment of last resort for those who couldn't afford the manufactured anonymity of a pill. This raw act highlighted the full, unadulterated shame and terror of the practice. These were not anonymous ingredients. This was the very essence of a man who had died seconds ago, consumed under the gaze of a vast, unfeeling crowd. While the wealthy were protected by powder and gold, the poor were forced to face the brutal reality of their medicine head-on. Driven by a fear so profound that the terror of cannibalism paled in comparison to the terror of the next seizure. Ultimately, the trade in human remains, flowing from the arena to the apothecary, created a supply chain of desperation that unified Roman society in its fear, even as it divided them in the manner of their horrific consumption. You have requested the next 700-word section in English, focusing on the philosophical and ethical justification used by Roman society and physicians for consuming human remains. The Roman Empire stood as the pinnacle of Western legal, philosophical, and architectural achievement. Yet, Within its sophisticated medical institutions lay a deeply unsettling practice: the consumption of human remains. This contradiction, the embrace of civilization alongside ritualized therapeutic cannibalism, presents a profound moral paradox. How did a highly organized society, one that often legislated against necrophilia and prohibited human sacrifice, rationalize the systematic ingestion of flesh and blood? The answer lies in the linguistic and philosophical boundaries drawn by the Roman intellectual class. Primarily the physicians, they needed to define the act as a pharmaceutical necessity, not a cultural or religious transgression. They argued that the act was not cannibalism, but rather a cold, clinical transaction designed to save a life from the terror of the sacred disease, morbus sacer. Roman physicians rigorously defended the practice by redefining the act. Cannibalism anthropophagi was universally condemned. It implied the eating of human flesh for food, out of hunger, or as a savage, ritualistic act. The consumption of gladiator remains, however, was classified as medicinae drug, a necessary therapeutic action. This distinction was the entire ethical shield. When a doctor prescribed powdered liver or sanguis calor, they were not instructing the patient to eat a dead man. They were instructing them to ingest a pharmaceutical ingredient containing the maximum concentration of vital essence vita. The ingredient's utility was purely chemical in Roman terms, humoral and energetic, devoid of the cultural taboo associated with the dead body itself. The patient, therefore, was not considered a savage. They were simply a person desperate enough to accept the most powerful, albeit repellent, drug available. The physician's role was to strip the act of its moral context and clothe it in the dignity of science. While many contemporary physicians treated these remedies as folk cures, figures like Galen played a crucial role in documenting and thereby formalizing the use of parts of the human body like powdered skull into the medical literature. By integrating such ingredients into complex formulas like the theriaca compound that required extensive preparation and processing, the physician further cemented the idea that the source material was no longer a human body part, but a processed medical powder. This process shielded the wealthy and the intellectual classes. By the time the ingredient reached the noble patient, it had been dried ground, mixed with dozens of herbs and spices, effectively becoming an anonymous component of a high-status prescription. This medicalization of the remains allowed the civilized Roman to maintain a sophisticated self-image while benefiting from the raw violence of the arena. Ultimately, the defense rested on the premise of necessity. Epilepsy was a curse that threatened social standing, sanity, and life itself. When faced with such a terrifying, incurable disease, Roman thought prioritized therapeutic efficacy over ethical comfort. If the only cure required a morally ambiguous act, the doctor's duty was to prescribe the cure. The philosophical argument stated that the life of the living, especially when threatened by the sacred, mysterious power of the morbus, sacerted precedence over the sanctity of the dead, particularly the bodies of criminals and disposable fighters whose lives were already forfeit to the state. The arena was the state's instrument, and the subsequent medical harvest was simply a useful byproduct, transforming a moment of public execution into a final, grotesque service to the empire's desperately ill. The practice was horrific, but in the Roman mind, it was meticulously rationalized and clinical. You have requested the next 700-word section in English. focusing on the economic system that arose from the gladiator blood cure. The Roman amphitheater, renowned for its spectacle and brutality, was fundamentally an immense economic machine. Beyond ticket sales and gambling, the arena generated a perverse secondary market, a lucrative trade in the remains of the dead. This was the dark underbelly of Roman celebrity and violence, the economy of deathware, the gladiator. His final breath was worth a premium in gold to the medical marketplace. The collection of human remains, far from being a disorganized scramble, was facilitated by an intricate financial infrastructure that connected the sands of the arena to the apothecaries of the city. The raw material, the fresh blood, sanguis calor, the liver, and the bones was not free. It was a commodity that generated blood money for several key figures within the gladiatorial system. The primary profiteers were the people who controlled access to the dying body. The lanista gladiator trainer-owner. The lanista ran the gladiatorial school ludus and owned the gladiators outright. When a gladiator was condemned to die, Misio refused. The lanista lost a valuable asset, but gained an unexpected final payment. It is highly probable that the Lanistae or their agents brokered deals with local physicians or specialized vendors pharmacopole to sell the remains. This final transaction essentially maximized the value of the dying gladiator, transforming his corpse into a high-demand commodity immediately following the spectacle. The arena attendants, these low-level workers, such as the executioners, the body haulers libertinari, and the attendants who cleaned the arena, were crucial intermediaries. They were the ones on the ground, holding the cups or collecting the freshly spilled organs. They facilitated the trade between the source, the dying man, and the consumer, the desperate family, or the apothecary's agent. They accepted small bribes or payments for positioning, speed, and discretion, ensuring the vital warmth of the blood was preserved. These payments represented a side hustle, a crucial piece of income derived from their unique access to the dead. Once the remains left the arena, they entered the formal medical marketplace, drastically increasing in price. The apothecaries pharmacopole were the final and perhaps most important profiteers. They purchased the raw, ghastly materials, dried liver, powdered bone, or crystallized blood and transformed them into expensive, prepared remedies like the theriac. By grinding the remains and mixing them with costly spices, herbs, and oils, they stripped the ingredient of its repulsive origin and dramatically inflated its value. The wealthy who purchased the purified theriac paid an enormous markup, funding the entire macabre supply chain. This intersection between the bloody spectacle and clinical commerce normalized the act. The demand was driven by the universal fear of epilepsy. The supply was guaranteed by the state-sanctioned violence of the games. The economy of death was self-sustaining. The fear created the demand. The arena provided the cheap high-potency source. And the medical market provided the laundering mechanism that made the act acceptable to the elite consumer. The existence of this structured financial relationship confirms that the consumption of gladiator remains was not a fringe activity. It was an integrated, if dark, component of the ancient Roman economy, driven by cold calculation and human desperation. While the consumption of gladiator remains for epilepsy was rationalized under the guise of formalized medicina, pharmaceutical act, the use of human bodies in ancient Rome extended far deeper into the realm of folk magic, superstition, and domestic desperation. The boundaries between the respected physician and the suspicious sorceress venefica were often blurry, especially when dealing with the unexplainable traumas of life, such as infertility, uncontrollable passion, or the desire to inflict a potent curse. The widespread cultural belief in Vita transference did not stop at the arena. It infused every aspect of Roman magic and ritual. The fundamental concept remained the same. The dead retained a potent residual energy that could be manipulated for the benefit or detriment of the living. This belief system provided a terrible power to those on the margins: women, slaves, and others who lacked legal or social authority. For many Romans, particularly women whose lives were controlled by patriarchal structures, magic offered a powerful means of control. Human remains became key ingredients in fertility charms and passion potions. It was believed that certain parts of a man who died suddenly or tragically a potent, lingering death could transfer that intense vita into a passive individual. For instance, the fingers or bones of those who had been hanged or executed were prized. The belief was that their spiritus breath, spirit lingered, having not been properly released through a quiet, natural death. These remains were ground, sometimes mixed with herbs, and administered as aphrodisiacs, or placed near the hearth to ensure successful conception. The power of the violent dead was seen as a way to overcome the weakness and unpredictability of the female body, or to ensure the fidelity of a restless husband. Perhaps the most sinister widespread use of human remains was in the execution of curses. Across the Roman world, thousands of curse tablets, defixiones, have been unearthed: small lead or wax sheets inscribed with venomous wishes against rivals, lovers, or competitors. To make these curses stick, one needed to invoke the manes, the spirits of the dead. This invocation was often achieved by placing the tablets directly into graves or incorporating materials from the dead. Human hair, nails, or even the remnants of menstrual blood or semen, if the curse-targeted passion, were sometimes placed alongside the tablet to give the curse a powerful personal anchor. The magician relied on the dead man's spirit to carry the curse into the underworld and ensure its potent execution against the victim. These practices often targeted the marginal, the weak, the dispossessed, or the victims of sudden violence, whose spirits were thought to be restless and therefore susceptible to magical command. The desperation of the epileptic seeking a cure and the desperation of the lover seeking control both drew from the same chilling reservoir: the bodies of the dead. This parallel demonstrates that Roman society had a dual economy of death. One part was the formalized, high-priced, and rationalized medical use. The other was the secretive, folk-driven, and often low-cost use by witches and local healers. Both acknowledged the powerful magic of the corpse. Ultimately, the documented uses of human blood, liver bone, and other materials for everything from medicine to magic underscore a foundational cultural truth. Despite Rome's veneer of rational law and order, a deep-seated, terrifying belief in the residual power of the violently slain pervaded every social strata, driving citizens toward the most horrific and unspeakable acts to achieve control over their destiny. For centuries, the gruesome practice of consuming gladiator remains was sustained by the sheer terror of epilepsy, and a medical theory rooted in the transference of vita. However, as the Roman Empire entered its late classical period, the first significant cracks began to appear in this barbaric edifice, driven by two powerful forces: intellectual skepticism within medicine and the profound theological opposition of a rapidly growing new religion. the towering figure of Galen's 2nd century AD, though often documenting the use of human materials and remedies like theriac, inadvertently planted seeds of doubt. While he recorded the cultural belief in the potency of sanguis calor, Galen's work increasingly emphasized rigorous anatomical study and a refined understanding of humoral pathology. He was meticulous, seeking natural, verifiable causes for disease rather than relying purely on magical transference. His massive body of work subtly shifted the focus of elite medicine away from the desperate folk cures of the arena toward complex botanical remedies. Galen's approach demanding intellectual rigor and logical processes undermined the basic premise of therapeutic cannibalism. If a cure could be found through balanced humors, sophisticated herbal compounds, and precise diagnosis, why rely on the raw, unpredictable, and ethically repugnant transfer of a dying man's essence? Though Galen did not universally condemn the practice, his scientific legacy created the philosophical space necessary for later physicians to reject it entirely. The true decisive blow against the economy of death came not from a medical school, but from the catacombs and burgeoning churches of the empire. The rise of Christianity. Early Christian doctrine held an absolute and revolutionary belief in the sanctity of the human body both during life and after death. The concept of the resurrection of the body made the integrity of human remains a central theological concern. While Roman paganism viewed the dead body as ritually impure and often disposable, especially the bodies of criminals and slaves, Christianity viewed the body as a vessel for the soul and a future participant in eternal life. Therefore, the acts of harvesting, grinding, and consuming human flesh and blood were not merely unethical in the Christian view. They were profoundly sacrilegious. They mocked the belief in the resurrection and violated the core tenet of treating every person, even a condemned criminal or a gladiator, with inherent dignity. Christian writers quickly identified therapeutic cannibalism as one of the most disgusting practices of the pagan world. Tertullian, late 2nd century AD, a fierce critic of Roman customs, directly challenged the practice, pointing out the hypocrisy of a society that falsely accused Christians of cannibalism while openly consuming gladiator blood for medicine. He used the stark horror of the arena's harvest as a powerful rhetorical weapon against paganism. As Christianity gained legal status under Constantine and eventually became the state religion of the empire, the cultural tolerance for such practices evaporated. What was once a sanctioned, if dark, medical remedy quickly became defined as a repulsive form of necromancy or folk magica, vestige of the dark, defeated pagan past. The state, now influenced by Christian morality, began to enforce new ethical boundaries. The supply chain from the arena was severed, not necessarily by medical decree, but by theological censure and legal prohibition. By undermining the philosophical justification and eradicating the social acceptance of the practice, the Church systematically demolished the foundations of the blood money economy, ushering in a new, albeit slow, age of medical ethics. The morbicacre would remain terrifying, but the cure would no longer be found on the body of the freshly slain. You have requested the next 700-word section in English, detailing the ultimate decline and geographical retreat of therapeutic cannibalism. The practice of consuming human remains, blood, liver, and bone did not vanish overnight with a single imperial decree. Rather, the use of gladiator remedies faded slowly, a process of geographical and chronological retreat that spanned centuries. The decline was fueled less by a sudden moral enlightenment, and more by the continuous pressure from theological opposition and the quiet triumph of new, refined medical doctrines that simply rendered the barbaric cures obsolete. By the 4th century AD, the center of medical learning was shifting away from Rome and toward the intellectual hubs of the Eastern Empire, particularly Alexandria and Constantinople. These centers, steeped in Greek and Hellenistic tradition, placed a renewed emphasis on Galenic medicine. While Galen's work hadn't explicitly banned the use of human parts, his emphasis on complex herbal compounds, controlled theriac recipes, and detailed anatomical observation naturally sidelined the crude, superstitious act of rushing the arena. The new medical schools began to develop effective alternatives. Sophisticated plant-based remedies like those featuring valerian or peony were increasingly prescribed for seizures. The necessity of using human vita was challenged by new chemical and botanical knowledge, making the arena-based cure an embarrassing relic of the past. The educated professional physician in the East gradually stopped prescribing it, not because it was inherently evil, but because it was medically unsophisticated. The decline was powerfully accelerated by the triumph of Christianity. After Emperor Theodosius banned gladiatorial combat entirely in the late 4th century, though it lingered in some provinces, the supply chain of death was functionally severed. This was the most effective practical measure against the remedy, that already state-sanctioned supply of fresh, violently killed bodies. The market for sanguis calor collapsed. However, the use of prepared human remains, dried bone meal, or powdered sculpur persisted longer, especially in the disorganized folk medicine of the Western Empire following its collapse. The Eastern Byzantine Empire, with its strong legal tradition and official state religion, worked more aggressively to eliminate these vestiges of pagan necromancy. Byzantine law and church decrees explicitly condemned any form of body desecration or use of human material in healing. The practice, once a tolerated dark component of imperial life, was rebranded as sorcery and criminalized. This shift effectively drove the remaining practitioners underground, separating the dark act from the respectable medical profession once and for all. Despite the imperial ban, the remedy's cultural power rooted in centuries of ferment, it died a slow death in the geographical margins of Europe. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that powdered skull and fat were still occasionally used in folk remedies for epilepsy throughout parts of medieval Western Europe, far removed from the strict medical academies of the Byzantine East. This final, localized persistence highlights the original problem. For a disease as terrifying and poorly understood as epilepsy, desperation could always resurrect the most ancient, horrifying cures. Ultimately, the practice of consuming gladiator blood for epilepsy faded due to a confluence of factors. The intellectual superiority of Galenic herbalism, the closure of the arena supply by imperial decree, and the systematic theological censure by the Church. The final prescription for this horrific cure was not a miraculous healing, but the steady, inevitable march of new beliefs and better medicine, leaving therapeutic cannibalism relegated to the darkest, most desperate footnote in Roman history. The story of the Roman cure for epilepsy, the systematic harvesting and consumption of the gladiator's blood, liver and bones, more than a grotesque historical footnote. It stands as a terrifying and enduring testament to two fundamental human truths: the absolute power of desperation and the persistent triumph of myth over science. In one of the most intellectually advanced societies of the ancient world, where engineers constructed sprawling aqueducts and philosophers debated the nature of truth, the medical community ultimately prescribed cannibalism. This was not a fringe practice relegated to the deepest provinces. It was a phenomenon played out in the very shadow of the Colosseum, the heart of Roman civilization. It proves that when confronted with a disease that is mysterious, incurable, and socially devastating, the human mind will abandon all rational constraints and embrace the most extreme belief systems. The core fallacy was the concept of vita transference. The Romans, lacking true neurological understanding, saw the seizure as an invasion, a loss of vital essence. They reasoned that the most aggressive countermeasure must be the immediate injection of supreme, violently released vitality. This powerful, primitive logic, rooted in the magic of the kill, overrode the clinical skepticism of physicians like Galen and the basic moral repugnance of the act. The desperate need for a cure transformed the gladiator from a condemned man into a sacrificial ingredient. Valued precisely because of the violence of his death, the legacy of this dark practice is a sharp lesson in cultural blindness. Roman society normalized the horror by segmenting it. The wealthy used money to purchase processed powders and pharmaceutical distance. The poor used necessity to justify immediate consumption. The physicians used philosophical jargon, medicina versus anthropophagy, to rationalize their complicity. This segmentation allowed the practice to thrive for centuries, proving that a moral line can be redrawn when enough desperation and economic incentive are applied. The money that flowed from the epileptic's desperation back to the lanista, and the apothecary cemented the trade, transforming a horrific accident of violence into a sustainable, structured economy of death. It took external forces, the radical moral authority of Christianity and the gradual intellectual evolution of Galenic medicine to finally dissolve this system. The Church forced a confrontation with the sanctity of the human body, while the new medical science provided less barbaric alternatives. The gladiator's blood was not eliminated because it was discovered to be medically useless, but because society finally declared it to be morally intolerable. The practice of consuming human remains is long gone, but the echoes of desperate medicine persist even today. Every time a patient seeks a miracle cure outside the bounds of established science, or when a vulnerable population is exploited for the promise of a potent new therapy, we see the ghost of the sanguis calor cure. The story compels us to ask, what moral constraints are we willing to sacrifice in our own desperate search for cures to modern diseases? It is a stark reminder that advanced civilization and technological progress do not inoculate humanity against panic or superstition. The greatest scientific achievement is not merely finding a cure, but finding a cure while upholding the dignity of human life. The legacy of the arena teaches us that the fight against disease is also a continuous ethical battle against the human tendency toward fear, exploitation, and the powerful primitive belief in magic over the hard-won truths of science. The gladiator's blood dried in the Colosseum sands 2 millennia ago, but its stain remains as a perpetual warning against the seductive power of desperate solutions.